The air is thick, heavy. A distant clatter echoes through the hall. Metal scrapes against stone. Footsteps. Or something else. A shadow shifts. It shouldn't move, but it does. Faster now. A low, strangled sound rises and falls. There's no one there. Or maybe too many. Candles flicker. One falls. Darkness swallows the floor. A whisper of movement just at the edge of sight. Something is watching. Something waits. The walls themselves seem to lean in closer. A hand reaches out, grips, trembles, releases, nothing. Silence. Time stretches. Seconds feel like hours. Breathing becomes a burden. A chair tips over. A door creaks. Then stillness. No explanation. No warning. Just the sense that everything is wrong. That something impossible has begun. The air tastes of iron and fear. Shadows dance across faces that are too still. Eyes that see too much. The sound of a heartbeat, your heartbeat, fills the empty space. But it's not your own. Something moves behind the mask. Something hidden. Something terrifying. And then a question lingers in the cold air, unanswered. What happens when the face you trust most hides a horror no one was meant to see? Asterisk, the year is 1174. The Holy Land is a fragile tapestry of power, faith, and fear. Crusader kingdoms cling to existence, surrounded by enemies on all sides. Fortified cities rise like stone sentinels, their walls a thin barrier between life and annihilation. The air itself seems charged with tension, as though every whisper could ignite war. At the heart of this turbulent land stands the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Its leaders walk a precarious line between diplomacy and battle, alliances forged and broken in the blink of an eye. Every day brings the threat of siege, every night the dread of betrayal. Messages fly across stone corridors. Riders race along dusty roads. Soldiers patrol battlements under the weight of constant vigilance. The city's pulse is a drumbeat of fear and expectation. Amid this volatile backdrop, King Baldwin IV sits on a throne hidden behind a mask. Rumors swirl in the courts, murmurs of sickness and weakness, yet his presence commands both respect and terror. Military campaigns stretch the kingdom's resources. Neighboring powers watch for the slightest sign of faltering. Every decision, every movement, carries consequences that ripple far beyond the walls of Jerusalem. The threat is not only external. Internal tension simmers as factions within the court plot and scheme, each trying to shape the kingdom's future. Soldiers move in perfect formations, knights maintain strict discipline, and messengers carry news that could shift the balance of power. Fear is constant fear of the unknown, fear of what lies behind the mask, fear of the next attack. Yet beneath the surface, uncertainty grows. Strange occurrences, rumors of illness, and unexplained absences unsettled both nobles and commoners alike. The city stands on a knife's edge, balanced between survival and chaos. Every corner of the castle, every shadowed hallway feels alive with potential danger, and the people whisper among themselves, something is coming, something that history may never fully reveal. In this climate of war and suspicion, secrets thrive. Every soldier, every messenger, every servant becomes a witness to a tension that cannot be named. The very air carries a weight of expectation. The line between loyalty and fear, courage and desperation blurs. And at the center of it all is a king whose face conceals a story that no chronicler dared write in full. The stage is set. Every soldier prepares. Every guard watches. Every citizen waits. And history begins to hide what cannot be spoken aloud. Asterisk among the soldiers standing guard in the stone corridors. There is one who feels the weight more than others. A knight, young yet disciplined, trained to the point of instinct, moving as if the walls themselves guided his steps. Each day begins before dawn. The clang of armor, the smell of wax and stone, the repetitive rhythm of drills. Every step precise, every movement calculated. There is no room for hesitation. The rules are absolute. A single mistake can mean death, dishonor, or worse. Orders are obeyed without question. Breaches of protocol are punished swiftly, with cold efficiency. Yet even in this rigid world, fear persists. Soldiers whisper in corners, eyes darting to shadowed corridors. They share rumors they do not fully understand, stories half-remembered, warnings that cannot be spoken aloud. Daily life is a regimented march. Training, patrol, meals taken in silence, and prayers whispered under breath. Yet even as the soldiers follow their routines, the atmosphere is tense. Everyone senses that something lies beneath the surface. Every glance at the throne, every visit from the king carries unspoken questions. Is he weak? Is he in danger? Will the next order be the last? Emotion simmers under the surface. Soldiers carry their fear quietly, masked by discipline. At night, in the barracks, they speak in hushed tones about what they have seen. Strange shadows, sudden disappearances, odd illnesses. They exchange glances that say more than words. Loyalty and dread coexist uneasily. This group of men, trained for battle and strategy, is also human. They feel uncertainty, anxiety, and even awe. Every day they step into a world where their lives are part of a story far larger than themselves. Every patrol, every report, every night spent standing watch is a chapter in a narrative they cannot control. Among them, a Nighthauer silent observer stands out. Not because he is braver, but because he notices what others ignore. Every twitch of a guard, every missed signal, every faint whisper of movement behind closed doors draws his attention. He senses that the story unfolding is beyond training, beyond protocol. Something unseen, something terrifying, has begun. And as the soldiers march through hallways that seem to stretch endlessly, the question lingers. What will happen when the mask is finally removed? The first signs were almost imperceptible. A whisper carried along the corridors, too faint to trace, like a breath of wind moving against the stone. At first, the soldiers dismissed it. Old walls, settling under the weight of time. The castle had always groaned in the quiet hours of the night. But the whispers persisted, growing more distinct, sharper. A messenger failed to appear on schedule. The knight who usually delivered news of the day's orders simply did not return. At first, it seemed an oversight, a delay. But the delay stretched into hours. Patrols were sent out, retracing steps along dimly lit hallways. Every door they checked was locked. Every corridor was empty. Silence pressed against their ears, making each footstep sound like a shout. The sentries began to notice patterns that made no sense. Footsteps echoing when no one moved. Shadows lingering longer than light should allow. A flicker of movement at the edge of Visuna doorway, a curtain, a guard who had never left his post, but when they turned, nothing remained. Tension mounted, fingers brushed the hilts of swords more often, eyes scanning corners that previously required no attention. Even the king's presence seemed unpredictable. Behind the mask, his eyes occasionally lingered too long, staring past one soldier across the hall, at a place no one else could see. It was subtle, almost imagined, but no one could ignore it entirely. Rumors began to stir. Servants whispered of rooms left empty for hours. Officers murmured about councils that ended abruptly minutes before their time. Orders were given and then erased, as if they had never existed. Communication itself began to fail. Messages went unanswered. Couriers reported finding empty halls where meetings were supposed to be held. Notices posted in the chambers disappeared overnight. Even the young knight, trained to read the rhythms of the castle, felt a growing dissonance in the routine. Something was changing. Something unseen was shaping the daily life of the soldiers and officials alike. The air carried a new weight. It smelled faintly of smoke and iron, or perhaps it was imagination, a projection of the growing fear. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, sharing fleeting observations. "Did you see it?" One would whisper. "It moved," another replied. No one pressed for explanations, for fear of drawing attention to their own doubts. The castle had become a maze of unanswered questions. The nights were worst. Patrols returned with stories they dared not fully articulate. Candles extinguished spontaneously. Faint scratching on walls, as if someone or something was tracing invisible patterns. Footsteps fell in sync, then out of step. Doors creaked open, then slammed shut with no one inside. The young knight began to feel the weight of unseen eyes, counting his every move, measuring his every breath. Even routine training felt off. Drills that had once been precise now faltered. Swords clashed with unexpected sound, shields trembled, and formations broke apart inexplicably. Soldiers blamed fatigue, the stress of the war, or the sickness that lingered in the city. But instinct told them this was not ordinary. There was a method behind the unease, a pattern that could not yet be understood. The whispers in the corridors, the vanished messengers, the flickering shadows all pointed to something approaching, something that could not be prepared for. And in those moments, when no one dared speak aloud, the castle itself seemed to hold its breath. Every stone, every doorway, every shadow conspired to hide the truth, while the soldiers, disciplined and trained, found themselves trapped in a growing maze of dread. Asterisk, and above it all, behind the mask, the king remained calm, or at least he appeared so. But those who glimpsed his eyes noticed a flicker-in, unspoken warning that something was coming. Something that no order, no sword, no discipline could prevent. Every missed signal, every unexplained silence, every shadow that moved too long was a warning, yet no one could interpret it. No one could prepare for what was about to unfold. The question haunted the halls, whispered behind closed doors and echoed through empty chambers. What is coming behind the mask? And who will survive when it arrives? Asterisk, the hour had grown late. Shadows pooled in the corners of the castle like liquid darkness, stretching across walls, crawling along the floors. The young knight stood at his post, eyes sharp, muscles taut, ears straining for the familiar rhythm of the castle footsteps, whispers, the creak of hinges. But tonight, the rhythm was broken. It began subtly. A soft scraping sound, like stone shifting under weight, echoed from deep within the northern corridor. The knight's hand tightened around his sword hilt. The sound paused. Then it came again, closer, faster, impossible to ignore. A whisper followed, not in words, but in breathless movements of air. Sweeping across the corridor like fingers brushing the stone walls, a door at the end of the hall trembled, barely audible at first. Then it shook violently, rattling its iron hinges. The guards froze. Time stretched. Every heartbeat seemed magnified, and suddenly the door swung open, almost of its own accord, revealing nothing, no one, but the corridor beyond shimmered with an uncanny stillness. A draft, perhaps, or a trick of the candlelight. The knights could not say. Then came the footsteps. They were multiple, yet too synchronized, too deliberate, echoing in a pattern that made no sense. Soldiers moved instinctively to intercept, but the hall twisted. Corridors seemed longer than they were. Doors led to rooms that had no previous existence. Every attempt to reach the source failed. Each corner turned revealed only shadows. Yet shadows that shifted just beyond recognition. A sudden clatter from the armory made the knights whirl. The sound of weapons falling, as if knocked from invisible hands, filled the hall. A candle went out. Another followed. Darkness claimed the space between soldiers. Whispers rose, frantic and overlapping, incomprehensible. The young knight's pulse surged. Something was moving through them, something unseen, yet felt in every muscle, every nerve. From the grand hall, a low vibration began, subtle at first, like a tremor beneath the stone. It grew louder, almost a hum, resonating with the bones themselves. The soldiers clutched their swords tighter. Footsteps, whispers, creaks all overlapped into a cacophony of confusion. Orders were shouted, names called, yet no one answered. Not the messengers, not the sentries. Silence met their commands. Then a screamed, distant, hollow, yet unmistakable. It was swallowed by the stone walls almost immediately, leaving an echo that seemed to linger in the ears long after the sound faded. The knights froze, eyes darting to one another. No one could locate its source. It was not human, or perhaps it was something beyond human comprehension. The castle itself seemed to resist their movement. Hallways stretched, doors disappeared, walls seemed to close in. Knights collided with each other, lost balance, stumbled. And yet the movement of whatever haunted them remained just beyond reach. Every attempt to regroup failed. Signals were ignored, radios fell silent, messengers were nowhere to be found. The young knight's mind raced, trying to impose order on chaos. But the logic of the castle had dissolved. A shadow detached itself at the far end of the corridor. It moved unnaturally, almost gliding. The soldiers raised their weapons, but the figure vanished before they could approach. Whispers followed again, not voices, but movements in the air that seemed to speak warnings they could not interpret. Candles flickered violently, casting grotesque shapes on the walls. Armor clanged in unison, though no hand had struck it. And then, silence. Complete, oppressive silence. The kind that presses against the skin, fills the ears, and makes every thought echo endlessly. Soldiers looked around, expecting, fearing, praying. The young knight stepped forward, heart hammering. No footsteps. No shadows. The grand hall, the corridors, the entire castle seemed frozen in time. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound ceased entirely. No one moved. No one spoke. Even breathing felt suspended. And when the first voices whispered again, they were unsure if they were speaking to each other or merely imagining the conversation. When the patrols finally regrouped,
several soldiers were missing.
Not fallen. Not wounded. Simply gone. No trace of struggle. No footprints. No blood. Only a lingering coldness that refused to dissipate. The young knight searched, retraced steps, called names. But each corridor returned the same answer. Nothing. The castle held its secrets tight. Doors that had been opened now refused entry. Rooms that should have contained armor and messengers were empty, as if erased from existence. The echoes of footsteps, whispers, and cries lingered in the stone long after the event. But nothing tangible remained. The knights were left with confusion, fear, and the unshakable impression that they had witnessed something impossible. Something unseen had moved through the castle, leaving disorder and uncertainty in its wake. The king, behind his mask, observed silently. No words were spoken, no explanations offered. Only the cold gaze, calm yet unyielding, as if he alone understood what had occurred and what had been concealed from every other living soul. The young knight, and those who survived the initial chaos, were left with a single thought. What had emerged from behind the mask, and would it return? Asterisk, the moment dawn broke over the castle, the reality of the previous night sank in. What had happened could not be ignored. Orders went out immediately. Search every corridor, every room, every hidden passage. The young knight and his fellow soldiers moved methodically. Retracing their steps with mounting unease, the castle, once familiar and ordered, had become a labyrinth. Hallways that had been clear were now blocked by objects that had not been there before. Rooms appeared empty, yet a faint chill lingered in the air, as though the stone itself remembered the presence of something unseen. Soldiers called for the missing, their voices bouncing off the walls in a hollow echo. No answer came. Messengers were dispatched to the surrounding city. Patrols extended beyond the castle gates, scouring nearby streets and alleyways. Every courtyard, every gatehouse, every watchtower was inspected. Yet no trace of the vanished soldiers, no evidence of struggle, no sign of what had occurred could be found. It was as if the incident had never taken place, except in the memories of those who had survived. Interrogations followed. Officers and guards were questioned in small groups, separately, to avoid contamination of testimony. Each described the same sequence of strange events. Footsteps without owners. Shadows that moved alone, whispers carried on empty air. Yet contradictions appeared immediately. Times differed. Locations shifted in recollection. One soldier swore a door had slammed to the left, another insisted it was to the right. A messenger's voice, heard clearly by one, had been silent for another. Even the king's aides were drawn into questioning. They spoke only in fragments, describing glimpses of movement, sensations of presence, shadows that seemed to linger on the edge of their vision. And behind the mask, the king remained quiet. Observers noted a flicker in his eyes when questions were posed, but no explanation followed. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing confusion of his men. Reports were compiled, yet each seemed incomplete. Records of the patrols vanished. Logs of orders disappeared. Messages that had been sent were never received. When clerks attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events, gaps appeared, holes that could not be explained. It was as if the castle itself had conspired to erase the night's events. The investigation expanded outward. Scholars and chroniclers were summoned to document the events, but even they were hesitant. Accounts differed depending on who was asked, and many seemed to remember only fragments. Some witnesses later claimed to have seen corridors that did not exist, rooms that had been altered or shifted. Others insisted that the missing soldiers had simply disappeared into the shadows, though what that meant remained impossible to define. Despite the exhaustive searches, questions remained unanswered. No evidence of struggle, no signs of external intrusion, no footprints, no marks on the walls. It was as though the incident had been orchestrated by an unseen hand, perfectly designed to confound, confuse, and vanish. The young knight, standing once more in the hall where it had all begun, could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing on him. The stone seemed heavier, the shadows longer, the silence more profound. Every glance at the throne reminded him that the king's mask concealed truths no one else could access. The missing soldiers were never found. The whispers persisted. The castle remained intact, yet subtly altered, as though the night had left a secret etched into its very structure. And somewhere in the corridors, behind doors that led nowhere, or perhaps in rooms that had never existed, the memory of that night lingered. A presence remained unseen but undeniable, reminding all who had survived that what had happened could not be fully explained. No report, no testimony, no investigation could capture the full scope of the event. And the young knight and every soldier who lived through it knew one thing with chilling certainty: history would not reveal the truth. Some things were meant to remain behind the mask. When historians later examined the events of that night, they were left with more questions than answers. The records were fragmented, the testimonies contradictory, and the official reports strangely muted. Over time, several theories emerged attempting to explain what had occurred behind the mask. Some chroniclers suggested that an otherworldly force had passed through the castle. Shadows that moved without bodies, whispers with no source, doors that opened and closed of their own accord. These were cited as evidence of a supernatural intrusion. Witnesses described a presence that seemed to anticipate their movements, that toyed with the soldiers' senses before disappearing entirely. Skeptics, however, questioned the reliability of the witnesses. Could fear, fatigue, and stress have produced illusions so vivid that they became indistinguishable from reality? The accounts themselves contradicted each other. Some described the presence as cold, others as oppressive, yet all agreed it left a trace of dread. Another possibility focused on human design. Some historians argued that the event was orchestrated by a faction within the castle, using deception to destabilize the king's guards or test loyalty. Certain doors had been tampered with. Signals were miscommunicated. Patrols became confused. Yet no evidence of saboteurs was ever found. Soldiers disappeared without trace, leaving no mark of escape or capture. Could a plot of such precision truly exist, or had the trail been deliberately erased to cover higher-level complicity? The documents were inconsistent, with entire pages of logs missing, giving this theory both weight and doubt. A third theory considered the psychological and physical state of those involved. Chroniclers noted that the king's own condition masked hidden, and often solitary, might have affected the environment around him. Some witnesses experienced hallucinations, extreme anxiety, or panic under stress. Perhaps the collective fear manifested in tangible ways: shadows elongated, whispers imagined, doors misperceived. Yet even with this theory, the total disappearance of soldiers remained unexplained. How could imagination alone account for physical absence? The gaps in the records left this question unresolved. Finally, a more disturbing hypothesis centered on the king himself. Behind the mask, perhaps he harbored knowledge or power that had triggered the night's events. Some suggested the mask was not merely a shield for illness, but a symbol of control, concealing something so dangerous that even the closest advisors were unaware. Witnesses spoke of glances from the king that unsettled them, movements that seemed to respond to unseen signals. Yet nothing in the surviving documents confirmed this. Pages had been erased, reports withheld, and witnesses, if they survived, were sworn to secrecy. This theory offered the most chilling implication, that the truth was deliberately hidden, not by accident, but by design. Each theory, when examined, raised as many questions as it answered. Contradictions abounded. Files vanished. Testimonies conflicted. Witnesses later recanted or disappeared. What remained was an unsettling certainty. The full truth would never be known. The king's mask had concealed more than his illness, it had concealed the unknown. The castle itself seemed to keep its secrets. Walls that had held shadows and whispers remained silent when investigated, as if the stones themselves remembered the night and refused to speak. Even modern historians, piecing together fragments of letters, reports, and personal diaries, could only speculate about what had truly occurred, and so the question endures. Was it a supernatural event? A calculated political maneuver? A collective hallucination? Or a secret hidden by the king himself? Each explanation holds pieces of the puzzle, but no theory fits entirely. Some truths were never written, some records deliberately erased, some witnesses silenced forever. One certainty remains: history hides what cannot be confronted. And behind the mask of King Baldwin IV, the shadow of that night lingers, waiting in silence, unresolved, and impossible to fully understand. Time passes, yet the castle remains unchanged. Stone walls still bear the echoes of that night, though no one can hear them. Corridors remain silent, shadows lingering where they should not. The air feels heavier here, as if it remembers, as if it holds the memory of what transpired behind the mask. The young knight, now long removed from those halls, never forgot. He carried the weight of unanswered questions, the fragments of whispers, the vision of disappearing soldiers, and the king's unreadable eyes. Every retelling faltered, every account conflicted. No report could contain the truth. No document could capture the full scope of what had occurred. Some mysteries resist explanation. Some events, no matter how diligently investigated, leave only voids where answers should be. And history, in its wisdom, more its indifference, sometimes chooses to hide what is too dangerous, too unsettling, or too incomprehensible. Behind the mask, the truth was buried. Not lost, but deliberately concealed. The castle stands today as it did then, intact, silent, and unyielding. Visitors may pass through the corridors unaware. Scholars may study the archives without finding clarity. And yet the memory of that night lingers unseen, unfathomable, unresolved. It exists in the gaps, in the missing records, in the hushed warnings that slip through cracks in the stone, and so the question endures. What truly happened behind the mask of King Baldwin IV? Was it fear, design, madness, or something beyond human understanding? History may never answer. All that remains is the shadow of a truth too unsettling to confront. The whispers persist in memory, the cold lingers in imagination, and the mask itself, symbol of concealment, of mystery, of terror, remains a barrier between knowledge and curiosity. Perhaps the only way to approach the answer is to look closer, to question, to wonder, and to share your own theories. For in speculation, in conjecture, the story of that night continues to live. What do you believe truly lies behind the mask?